The plane touched down quietly under the dim lights of Gaborone International Airport. No red carpet, no motorcade of 20 cars. Just one man stepping down, a lone briefcase in hand. When asked why he traveled without his ministers, he smiled and said, "Because I can read my own documents." It's a small sentence, but one that echoes across an entire continent. In an era when many African leaders travel with entourages of dozens, assistants, protocol officers, and personal photographers, this president of Botswana has chosen a different path. He trims his team, carries his own files, and says, "I can go alone." For some, that may sound strange. For others, it's revolutionary. Because when a leader dares to stand alone, it's not arrogance. It's a declaration of self-reliance. A statement that he can think, decide, and act, not because someone whispers into his ear, but because he's done his homework, he knows his country, and he believes in it. This moment, captured in his own words, tells us something profound about the new generation of African leadership, men and women, who are not waiting for approval from former powers, who no longer see leadership as privilege, but as duty. And yet, it also raises a deeper question for all of us watching from afar. Can a nation truly stand tall when its leader insists on walking alone? And can Africa truly rise without being chaperoned by the West? If you believe that humility and courage still matter in leadership, if you believe that progress doesn't need extravagance but integrity, then stay with us. Because this story of a man, a nation, and a new kind of power might just restore your faith in what real public service looks like. Please share this video if you believe that the world needs more leaders who read their own briefcases. And subscribe if you still believe that truth and responsibility must come before prestige. It began not with applause, but with a quiet confession. "When I travel, I trim down the team," the president said, looking straight into the cameras. "I don't want to take the minister away from her core responsibilities. I don't need someone whispering in my ear because I haven't read or understood the documents. I can go alone." There was a murmur in the room, part admiration, part disbelief. In a continent where state visits often look like royal parades, he was saying something unheard of, that a leader's dignity doesn't come from the size of his delegation, but from the depth of his understanding. To him, leadership was intellect, not image. He reminded his audience that as president, he is also the chief diplomat of Botswana, the foremost spokesperson for his nation. And if he cannot represent his country alone, he said, then he does not deserve the title. The president can act on his own advice, he declared. If you have a problem with that, change the constitution. That wasn't arrogance. It was accountability, a man saying, don't complain, fix the system. And it set the tone for what would follow, a deep, brutally honest conversation about Botswana's most urgent crisis, electricity. He spoke with the precision of a lawyer and the urgency of a man whose country was running out of time. "We are a net importer of electricity," he admitted. "We spend billions every year importing power, mostly from South Africa. On paper, Botswana should be self-sufficient. But in reality, the nation has been living in darkness factories, idle rural clinics, without power, students reading under candlelight. The culprit? Two aging giants. Morapula A coal power plant that had outlived its lifespan and was merely surviving on extensions. Morapula B, the newer one that never reached full capacity. Morapula A, he said, will reach the end of its life in 2027. After that, the plant would have to be mothballed, taken offline, leaving the country with even less power. And Morapula B, plagued with design flaws, had never operated at its promised potential. The stakes couldn't be higher. Without a drastic solution, Botswana faced economic suffocation, the collapse of industry's unemployment, and rising costs of imported electricity. But then came the turning point. He announced a new international partnership, a consortium of global investors, each a powerhouse in its field. One company valued at $150 billion, another at $20 billion, alongside Botswana's own state corporations, like the Botswana Development Corporation and the Geoscience Institute. Together, they would rebuild the nation's power backbone. Their mission: refurbish Morapula B to achieve super-optimal output above 95% efficiency. Re-engineer Morapula A, extending its life by 10 to 15 years, possibly up to 25 with advanced technology. Upgrade the national transmission lines, the arteries of electricity, to ensure power stability. And ultimately build a coal-to-liquid system producing local diesel and petroleum products, keeping value inside the country. The president called it a monumental step forward, not just an energy deal, but a declaration of economic sovereignty. Because for the first time in decades, Botswana wasn't asking for aid, it was inviting investment without guarantees. These investors said, "We don't need a sovereign guarantee. In fact, if there is ever a need, we'll provide one ourselves." It was unprecedented, global corporations risking their own credibility to partner with a small African nation. The results he promised would be transformative. Botswana would move from importing electricity to producing a surplus of 760 megawatts, enough to export power to Zambia and even South Africa, the very country it once depended on. By doing so, the government would save up to $3 billion in import costs annually and eliminate the $75 million subsidy it currently pays each year to keep electricity affordable. Imagine, he said, keeping that money in our hands for schools, for hospitals, for development. The audience nodded. For the first time, they could see the numbers, the math of liberation. He ended the section with a line that cut through the noise. "This is not about prestige. It's about delivery. We are working day and night because our house is burning." It was not the kind of speech you hear from politicians who love comfort. It was the sound of a man in motion sleeves, rolled up eyes tired, but spirit unbroken. And for the people of Botswana, it was the first glint of light on broken glass, a sign that someone finally was willing to fight for a self-reliant nation. The tension in the room shifted. After laying out the nation's energy crisis and the billion-dollar rescue plan, the president paused, looked at the audience, and said quietly, "One member of parliament told me you're setting deadlines that are too tight." And I told her, "When your house is burning, you run at breakneck speed." For a few seconds, no one moved. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment the speech transformed from a policy briefing into a battle cry, because what he was describing was not just an economic reform, it was survival. He leaned forward, voice firm but almost weary. "I want to put myself under immense pressure," he said. "We must work day and night. Only after we have delivered will we be entitled to rest." Behind those words was a simple truth: Botswana's window of opportunity was closing fast. If the reforms failed, if Morapule collapsed, or if investors pulled out, there would be no second chance. The lights would literally go out. That is why he spoke not as a politician seeking applause, but as a commander on the front line of a national emergency. "Look at me," he told the crowd, half smiling. "You think I've slept?" The audience laughed nervously. He didn't. From that point, the speech became a confession of exhaustion and duty. He admitted that leading a country through crisis meant aging every day. It meant sleepless nights, anxiety, and the knowledge that people were, in his own words, catching hell on the downside of the economy. Yet rather than ask for sympathy, he turned his fatigue into fuel. "We don't have the luxury of comfort," he said. "We have the responsibility of action." That sentence struck deeply, not only in Botswana but across the region, because every African nation in one way or another has its own burning house. Then came the backlash. Not everyone believed his promises of a spectacularly different country in 3 years. Critics accused him of overconfidence. Some journalists claimed the timeline was political theater, designed to distract from failures. Others mocked his insistence on traveling alone, calling it performative humility. But he refused to flinch. Instead of attacking his critics, he challenged them to be better. "You have a keyboard and a pen. That doesn't make you an expert," he said, looking straight at the press benches. "If you want to be taken seriously, show us your credentials." The statement sent a shiver through the media corps. Some saw arrogance. Others saw a rare demand for accountability in both directions. He continued calm but unyielding. "Take the minister to task. Take the president to task. But first, establish the facts." It was an unusual call for discipline in a time when rumor often outruns reality. He wasn't trying to silence journalists. He was daring them to do their job as seriously as he did his own. Outside the conference hall, reactions spread quickly. On social media, young citizens clipped his burning house metaphor and shared it thousands of times. Veteran journalists debated whether he had crossed a line or simply spoken the truth. Regional analysts in South Africa and Namibia called the speech a new model of presidential communication, half technocrat, half preacher. But within Botswana, something subtler happened. For the first time in years, the public felt that someone at the top was not hiding behind committees or consultants. He had given them numbers, deadlines, even sleeplessness. He had made the government's pain visible. As the applause began to fade, he softened his tone. "I am humbled to be at the helm," he said quietly. "We are getting there fast." It wasn't a boast. It was a prayer. Because for him, the battle was not against opposition parties or critics. It was against time dependency and mediocrity, the silent enemies of progress. That night, state television replayed his words and families across Botswana listened. Some nodded in hope, others shook their heads in doubt. But no one could deny that something had shifted, a sense that leadership, once distant and ceremonial, had become human, again tired, flawed, but determined. In that silence after the applause, the nation stood at a crossroads. Would they rally behind a president who chose urgency over comfort, facts over flattery, or would they fall back into the familiar rhythm of skepticism and delay? Whatever the answer, one thing was clear: Botswana's burning house had found its firefighter. The morning after the president's speech, the capital of Gaborone felt strangely alive. In coffee shops and market stalls, people were still talking about it. 3 years, they repeated. He said 3 years. Some said it with pride, others with disbelief. But for the first time in years, the nation was talking about deadlines instead of excuses. In the weeks that followed, the first visible changes began to take shape. At the Morupule power complex, workers returned in double shifts. Engineers in orange helmets began tearing down old turbines. University students in energy programs volunteered for internships, hoping to be part of what many were now calling the rebirth of Botswana's light. The government had signed the contracts, and foreign engineers were already arriving from Oman, Switzerland, and Asia. Everywhere you could feel a new rhythm, cautious but determined. And yet behind the optimism, there was unease. Civil society groups began asking questions. How transparent is this deal? Who are the investors? Will ordinary citizens benefit, or will it just make the rich richer? In parliament opposition, lawmakers demanded a full audit of the contracts. The president's team responded by publishing parts of the agreements online, an unusual act of transparency in African politics. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the old way of doing business behind closed doors was no longer acceptable. For a continent often haunted by corruption, this move set a new tone: accountability as policy. And for Botswana's people, that shift mattered as much as the electricity itself. At the grassroots level, the effects rippled outward. The Botswana Power Corporation, which for years depended on government subsidies, began restructuring its pricing model. If the president's plan worked, the corporation would soon stand on its own, no more yearly bailouts of $75 million. That single reform had profound consequences. The freed-up funds could now be redirected toward education, agriculture, and healthcare, especially in rural communities long left behind. In a televised forum, a farmer from Francistown said, "We've lived through darkness both in our homes and in our politics. If this electricity plan truly happens, maybe our children will finally read under real light." That kind of hope was fragile but powerful. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some political analysts warned that the president's 3-year miracle might raise expectations too high. Others feared that his increasing personal control, traveling alone, acting on his own advice, could blur the line between confidence and concentration of power. But among ordinary citizens, the debate was more emotional than ideological. To them, the president's restlessness felt authentic, not authoritarian. He was not hiding behind committees or slogans. He was showing his exhaustion, his sleeplessness, his sense of urgency, and that in a time of global cynicism felt like leadership. By the end of the first year, public sentiment began to shift. Journalists who once mocked his burning house speech now covered the first shipment of refurbished turbines arriving at Morupule. Even skeptics had to admit something was actually moving. The electricity was not yet steady. Power cuts still happened. But now each blackout carried a strange kind of patience, because people believed that this time someone was working on it. And beyond the flickering lights of the cities, a deeper transformation was underway. The relationship between citizens and their government was changing from dependency to participation. People were beginning to understand what he meant when he said, "The best money is the money you have in your hands." In that simple sentence lay the heart of his political philosophy. Sovereignty begins at home, not in speeches, but in power lines, factories, and the dignity of work. From Washington to Geneva, the speech did not go unnoticed. In a world where African presidents are often spoken about but rarely listened to, this one from Botswana had managed to break through the noise. A headline in a U.S. policy journal read, "Botswana's president rejects luxury politics and may redefine African leadership." It was not just the message, but the manner, his insistence on traveling light, reading his own documents, and calling out media irresponsibility that fascinated Western observers. To them, this was a portrait they weren't used to seeing: an African leader who sounded less like a politician and more like an engineer on a mission. In the United States, some commentators drew comparisons with Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, presidents known for discipline and directness, not grandeur. They called him a technocrat with the heart of a reformer. Others, especially in economic circles, saw his energy plan as a quiet challenge to the international order. For decades, Africa's development model had been built on dependency aid loans and foreign advisors. But here was a president saying, "We can act on our own advice." That single phrase resonated far beyond Botswana's borders, because to Western diplomats and financial institutions, it raised an uncomfortable question. If African nations can now self-finance, self-engineer, and self-govern their key sectors, what role remains for traditional donors? It was a diplomatic tremor disguised as a development speech. In Africa, reactions were mixed but vibrant. In South Africa and Namibia, analysts praised Botswana for thinking regionally, especially its plan to export electricity across the southern African grid. In Zambia, officials quietly expressed interest in linking transmission lines to Botswana's future network. Even in Nigeria and Kenya, commentators began referring to the Botswana model, a phrase that would have seemed unthinkable a decade ago. For the first time, Botswana, a small, quiet country, had entered the continental conversation as a symbol of practical sovereignty. Meanwhile, in Europe, investors paid attention for a different reason. The idea of a $3 to $5 billion project without sovereign guarantees sounded risky, yet also refreshing. One Swiss financial paper wrote, "This could be the first African deal where investors trust the system more than the signatures." It wasn't just about electricity anymore. It was about credibility, the rarest currency in global politics. And across the Atlantic, among America's older audiences, veterans, churchgoers, retirees who had seen the world's moral pendulum swing too far, there was something deeply human in this story. A leader saying, "I can go alone," reminded them of a time when public service meant sacrifice, not spectacle. They saw in him a reflection of leaders they once trusted, not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to be tired, willing to be wrong, and still keep going. For many in the West, this moment also exposed a quiet irony. While the world debates climate policy and energy transitions, Africa, the continent once labeled powerless, is now writing its own blueprint for energy independence. Botswana's plan may not make global headlines like wars or elections, but in boardrooms, think tanks, and quiet corners of Washington, one question lingers. If a small African nation can power itself, who else might follow? And perhaps more importantly, what happens when Africa no longer needs to borrow its dignity? As the lights dimmed in the conference hall, the president's final words hung in the air like a quiet oath. "We are getting there. We're getting there fast. No fireworks, no grand music. Just a man tired, sincere, unguarded, reminding his nation that the work had only begun." Outside, reporters packed their microphones, but the people lingered. Some clapped softly, others simply stared. They understood that what they had witnessed was not a victory speech, but a promise made under pressure, one that could either define or destroy his legacy. 3 years. That was the timeline he had given. 3 years to rebuild the grid cut, the waste proof that Botswana could rise without foreign aid or political theater. It was an ambitious deadline, perhaps too ambitious. But he had chosen urgency over comfort, risk over routine, because in his words, when your house is burning, you don't walk. You run. And maybe that is the essence of this new African moment, the refusal to walk when the fire is at the door. Still, the warning is clear, not just for Botswana, but for the entire continent. If this vision fails, cynics will say Africa cannot manage its own destiny. If it succeeds, it could ignite a domino of reforms from Niger to Namibia, from Burkina Faso to Kenya, proving that sovereignty is not a slogan but a system. And somewhere across the ocean in America, people are watching too quietly, curiously, maybe even hopefully. Because in a time when many democracies feel hollow and leadership feels transactional, here stands a man from the heart of Africa saying, leadership is work, it is sleeplessness, it is service. So tonight, as we reflect on this story, let's ask ourselves, do we still recognize this kind of leadership when we see it? A man who reads his own documents, carries his own bag, and refuses to waste the people's money, not out of pride, but out of principle. In the end, this story isn't just about electricity or Botswana's economy. It's about moral power, the kind that can't be borrowed, bought, or outsourced. If you've stayed with us this far, perhaps you feel it too, that small spark of faith in humanity returning. Please share this video if you believe that Africa deserves leaders who work, not perform. And subscribe if you believe that truth, humility, and hard work should once again define what it means to lead. Because someday soon, when the lights of Botswana shine bright across the desert, we may all remember this moment when a single man said, "I can go alone," and somehow made the whole world follow.